15 May 1945, Munich. In a school copybook saved from a bombed-out apartment, a 32-year-old municipal draftsman named Carl M. wrote one line he dared not say aloud. "We lost the war twice, once in the ruins, again in the silence." He used a carpenter's pencil, hard lead, thick strokes, no flourish. Outside his window, there were no windows. Wind passed through stones. Whole streets were walls without rooms. Roof tiles lay like broken plates. Women carried them in buckets. Trümmerfrauen. Rubble women. Lines formed at a water pump, at a soup kitchen, at an office door where the occupation authorities hung typed notices. Curfew. Surrendered weapons. Prohibitions. Censorship. The American Army's green trucks idled near the Marienplatz. Military government placards declared new rules in German and English. The city's police wore new armbands. The old ones had been burned. The mathematics of ruin was simple. Munich, official reports said, was more than half destroyed, central districts far more. The risk of collapse was measured in angles and cracks. The city had poured millions of bricks into the effort to rise. Now millions were to be lifted and stacked, cleaned, reused. 2 hands could clean 30 bricks an hour. A block needed many thousands. The arithmetic of rebuilding began in buckets. Carl wrote again, "I will be honest," to paper. The act was a kind of prayer. He did not pray to a god. He prayed to time and to a file that no one would open. He listed names. His father missing since January 1945 after a last letter from the Vistula. His younger brother rumored captured. His neighbor, Frau Adler, dead in the February air raid. A colleague who had boasted that he would be the new building inspector, he had hanged himself in his office with a length of telephone cord the day after the Americans drove tanks up Ludwigstrasse. The Allied occupation entered quietly. The first American officer he saw was clean-shaven, with a notebook and a pistol. The man walked from door to door with an interpreter and asked for the responsible person. Carl, his hands stained with limestone dust, said he was a draftsman in the Bauamt. The officer ticked a box. "Return to office Monday," he said, according to Carl's later account in an oral history deposited decades later with a municipal archive. The order was a gift and a trap. He would have a desk. He would have to answer questions. Soldiers took over the best surviving buildings. Curfews were strict at first, 2,100 hours. Any light after that meant a knock. There were raids for radios. There were confiscations of bicycles. There were rumors of retribution. The city's silence after dark was dense. Cats moved in the alleys like shadows. Occasionally a gunshot. The next morning, a note pinned to a body, Luther. Occupation reports by the US. Military government, Bavaria, list moods like metrics. General attitude of population. Watchful, fatigued, cooperative when necessary, evasive when possible. Food availability, below minimum levels. 1,200 calories per day. Fuel, scarce. Coal, difficult to procure. Housing, non-existent for many. Squatting, widespread. The arithmetic of life was now measured in grams, degrees, cubic meters. Carl's first task back at the office was to draw lines across maps that had survived the firestorm. These were new diagrams to indicate dangerous structures, evacuation zones, and the location of soup kitchens. He sat at a bench with an ink pen and still damp rubber stamps bearing the crest of the new order, Office of Military Government for Bavaria. He stamped his drawings like a clerk stamping the present onto the past. On 27 May 1945, military police posted a notice. All members of the Nazi Party and its formations must register. The list of organizations was long: NSDAP, SA, SS, NSKK, NSFK, Hitlerjugend, BDM. DAF, KDF, RADI. The acronyms were a litany of a life that had wrapped around everything. There was no one without a connection. There was no one without a neighbor who could accuse. The first wave of denazification arrived as paper. The Fragebogen, a questionnaire in small boxes and troubled words. Have you ever been a member? Did you donate to? Did you donate to? Did you sign? Did you sign? Did you attend? Allied intelligence summaries say that the Fragebogen was both a census and a sieve. In the United States zone, more than 13 million forms were distributed. The arithmetic of guilt became a ledger to be balanced by printed categories. Karl took his form home. He had joined the party in 1937 to retain his job as a draftsman when the office merged with the Reich institutions. He had paid dues. He had attended meetings sporadically. He had drawn maps for an architect who designed barracks for foreign laborers outside the city. He had been assigned as an air raid warden, given a helmet and a whistle. He had not denounced anyone. He had not saved anyone. He had watched trains. He had watched smoke. He had stayed in his lane, a phrase that would not appear in any file. He checked boxes and paused over words. Mitläufer. Follower. It was a category offered later by the Sprüchkammern, the tribunals. For now, interrogations took place in requisitioned classrooms. An American lieutenant, a German clerk, a translator. Your name, your affiliations, your dates. An initial judgment. Some were dismissed from posts, others were handled by the courts. The Sprüchkammer hearings would arrive in 1946. The system needed time and files. Files needed people like Karl to maintain them. 30. June 1945. In the rubble of a bombed synagogue in the city's west, a group of displaced persons gathered for a service. A chaplain from the U.S. Army spoke about survival. He noted in his report, now in the Bundesarchiv, that German onlookers maintained a respectful distance. Some wept. It was impossible to know why. Contact with victims had begun, often at the edges of places where Germans had never imagined they would stand again. Displaced persons camps in Bavaria became towns of their own. At Feldafing, at Landsberg, at Fehrenwald, Jewish survivors created schools, theaters, newspapers. Polish forced laborers waited for repatriation. Soviet citizens feared to go home. The DP camps were both near and far. For Germans like Karl, they were on the tram line, but not part of the city's mental map. An Allied psychological warfare team showed films about the camps to the public, beginning in May. Karl's memoir says, "We were herded into a theater with broken seats and air that tasted of wet coats. The film was a procession of bones and eyes. People did not speak afterward. Outside, I saw a man vomit onto the cobblestones. Then we walked home." A British Control Commission report, reprinted in Allied records even in the American zone for purposes of comparison, observed that exposure to atrocity newsreels results in stunned affect followed by irritability or denial in a significant minority. Many insist they did not know. Some say they had suspicions but could not act. The spectrum is wide. The mathematics of ignorance is not pure. It is made of selective memory, fear, self-protection, and the human desire for a simpler story. The winter of 1946-47 was a hunger winter, the worst since the blockade of 1917. Coal ran out. Electricity was rationed. The ration book assigned calories like sentences. Bread, potatoes, ersatz everything. People boiled turnips and called them dinner. The cold was an arithmetic that settled in the bones. People stole coal from railcars. Children stripped bark from trees to burn. The black market bloomed under bridges and along station platforms. Food for a watch. shoes for cigarettes. Americans smoked Lucky Strikes. Germans began to count in packs. A day's labor might be worth 3 cigarettes. A small roast, an entire carton. The city's official economy ran on paper. The real economy ran on tobacco and risk. Cigarettes turned men and women into merchants. A former professor counted his inventory like a scholar of virtue, 70 packs hidden in a basement. A widowed electrician converted a coil of wire into a loaf of... In Luitpold Park, a woman bartered a wedding ring for a can of bacon. Occupation reports note widespread petty theft, organized pilferage, significant black market activity. The police, under Allied supervision, wrote hourly summaries that read like weather forecasts. Rain, then rumor, then a raid. For Karl, the arithmetic of his days had become ration cards and rubble. His evenings were for reading. The newspaper grew thicker, then thinner, then vanished when the presses ran out of paper. When the first Democratic City Council met, Karl went to the balcony once and listened to men he had known as party officials speak of liberty in a new register. They were careful with words. They were now something else. The system needed continuity. Continuity needed men who knew how to make files move and materials arrive. The Spruchkammer noticed. In 1946, a notice arrived. You are summoned. The Denazification Tribunal for Munich convened in August in a former school. The categories were set by law. The labels as spare as inventory tags, Hauptschuldige, major offenders, Belastet offenders, Minder Belastet, lesser offenders, Mitlaufer followers, Entlastet, exonerated. The trials at Nuremberg were for the architects. The Spruchkammern were for the bricklayers of a dictatorship. They would decide who had built and who had carried. Karl sat at a table and listened to his name. It is in the file still. Bundesarchiv, B162, Spruchkammerakten, Munich, case number 47M 2083. The prosecutor read from the Fragebogen. Party member since 1937. Employed by municipal office. Air raid warden. Attendance at meetings sporadic. No record of denunciations. One witness testified that he had allowed her to obtain a permit without verifying a party credential in 1943. It was both incriminating and exonerating. A whitewashing affidavit, a Purcellschein, signed by a pastor and a woman whose husband had been arrested in 1944. They said he was decent. He had kept his head down. He had looked away. The tribunal placed him among the Mitläufer, follower. No significant political activity. Fine of 100 Reichsmarks. Employment permitted with oversight. The mathematics of guilt had produced a result, a small penalty and a notation. The system used such outcomes to move forward. Allied intelligence summaries complained that the great mass of the German population prefers to see itself as misled rather than complicit. Occupation officers also reported that, without experienced personnel, administration ceases. The arithmetic of justice and stability is not solved by morality alone. It is solved by expedience, fatigue, and the weight of millions of cases. Others were not so fortunate. A municipal judge, a man who had signed off on death sentences for minor crimes in 1944, faced the tribunal. He had read the regulations as lines carved in stone. He had said, "I was within the law." He was removed, briefly imprisoned. By 1951, he held a legal advisory post at a private company. The 131er Gesetz, the 131 Law of 1951, designed to restore jobs and pensions to former public servants, was a legislative confession that a state inherits its personnel. Outside, trains arrived from the east. Between 1945 and 1950, more than 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled or fled from the territories that had been German or German-settled, East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, the Sudetenland, parts of Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania. They came with carts, sacks, children, and stories of terror on roads choked with carts, and terror in villages where the war had returned as vengeance. They arrived with nothing in places that had little to give. Bavaria received more than 2 million. In registry offices, officials stamped cards and assigned them categories: Flüchtling, refugee, Vertriebener, expellee, Umsiedler, resettled. They were assigned to districts like Freight. They were billeted in rooms by decree. The arithmetic of scarce space became policy. The Wohnungsamt, the housing office, was a battlefield. Walls held lists. Names moved up and down with every eviction, demolition, and rumor. Officials organized inspections. How many people in how many square meters? A mother of 3 in a single room. An old man in a kitchen. A widower with 6 chairs and a sofa was asked to surrender 2 chairs and his spare room to a family from Königsberg. He argued. The official wrote, "Refuses." To be enforced. Karl signed the order with an unsteady hand. Karl now managed billets and disputes. He became a minor officer in the arithmetic of rooms. He knocked on doors with a police escort and measured. He listened to arguments that echoed the whole decade. We have suffered. We have rights. We were here. We had to leave. He wrote it all down and moved the names from one column to another. His own apartment had a woman from Brünn and her son in the former parlor. He placed his table against the wall. He wrote at night while a child coughed behind a curtain. A new city was forming with the edges of old maps. Tension between locals and newcomers was documented like disease. Friction in rural municipalities as expulsions alter balance. An O.M. Gus report from 1947 observed, refugees often form separate associations. Locals accuse them of arrogance or lack of gratitude. Refugees accuse locals of indifference or hoarding. The arithmetic of integration involved ration coupons and school places and church pews. It also involved memory. Expellees carried photographs of houses they had fled. Locals carried photographs of houses that no longer existed. Both spoke in the grammar of theft. The city's official history from 1950 mentions the arrival of the Heimatvertriebene and praises their industry. It does not mention the cold nights when people tore down fences for kindling and fought over a sack of potatoes in the market. Displaced persons remained in Bavaria through the late 1940s. Jewish survivors formed political committees and organized emigration. Some married, some took jobs in the black market. There were frictions. Reports mentioned thefts and anti-Semitic incidents. In 1946, at the DP camp of Landsberg, a demonstration demanded visas to Palestine. German onlookers call it foreign. What it was a citizenry being born in the shadow of a state that had tried to kill them. The presence of these camps near German towns was a reminder no one requested, and it disrupted the narrative of universal victimhood that many Germans began to construct to make the days livable. In the summer of 1948, everything changed with money. Currency reform arrived like a season. On 20 June, the Allied authorities replaced Reichsmarks with Deutsche Marks. 10 old for 1 new. People lined up outside banks and schools. Karl stood in a line that stretched around the block and down a side street exploded by a bomb in 1944. He held his old bills in an envelope. He handed them to a clerk who handed him new ones with a new smell. The arithmetic of scarcity shifted overnight. Shop windows that had been empty filled with goods that had lurked in warehouses, waiting for a currency that meant something. Prices rose. The black market shrank to a shadow. Cigarettes receded from their throne. People bought dresses, a bit of sausage, a handful of hope. Marshall Plan shipments had already begun to arrive. flour, powdered milk, dried eggs, machinery, promises. Care packages came with letters from strangers in Ohio, Nebraska, and Ontario. Tinned ham and chocolate bars lay in boxes on kitchen tables with labels in English that suggested the world's size and the arbitrariness of borders. The occupation reports chronicled tonnage and delivery times, and the morale boost measured by smiles. The arithmetic of recovery needed calories and words. The Berlin blockade began later that year. It was far away, but it was also here. The Cold War drew lines across maps and minds. The airlift was a concept Carl could understand, the delivery of life in measured drops. A report from the U.S. Army Air Forces calculates the number of flights and the tonnage of coal and flour delivered to Berlin. The mathematics of survival became aviation and scheduling. In Munich, people stood at posters and felt something like pride for an effort that did not directly involve them, but reminded them that human beings can make systems that deliver warmth instead of death. At the Bauhaus, the language changed. A city plan from 1949 shows broad avenues drawn through old neighborhoods that had been destroyed and could now be redesigned without the ethical burden of bulldozing. The old quarters that had been cramped and charming now offered opportunities. Modernists drafted. Conservatives protested. The argument was about identity made concrete. The end result was blocks that reflected both aspirations and materials at hand. Cement, glass, duty. Carl earned a promotion. He was now a mid-level man, with a file cabinet and a desk whose drawers stuck as the wood swelled in summer. He kept two small photographs there, his father in a wool coat, his neighbor's daughter playing with a dog in 1938. Both were gone. He sensed he had been chosen not for excellence, but for caution. He never raised his voice. He avoided the edge of things. Democracy arrived in forms like envelopes, ballots, meetings, flags that did not blaze like the old flags. The Basic Law was passed in 1949. Konrad Adenauer spoke of freedom and security and guidance. West Germany was born in long sentences and a short oath. Carl voted in a school gymnasium where a portrait of Hitler had once hung. Now a cross hung there. Later, nothing did. Neutrality became decor. The denazification files were gradually closed. In the US zone, the process had slowed as the Cold War accelerated. An Allied intelligence summary notes, with bureaucratic melancholy, that procedures aimed at a thorough purge have been compromised by the need for administrative continuity, the desire to prevent Soviet exploitation, and the populace's fatigue. The mathematics of justice tallied a low sum. A few thousand criminal convictions for hundreds of thousands of documented crimes. Some criminals were dead. Others were otherwise occupied. Many were back in offices with new stationery. Carl's new boss had been removed in 1946. He returned in 1949 with a different tie and a grin he believed was modest. He shook hands. He used the word mistake often. He said, "We all have to build." It was not a confession. It was a directive. The city nodded. The files were rearranged. The Spruce-Kummer decisions went into boxes. The boxes went into basements. The basements flooded in the spring of 1952 and a few files were lost. The loss was both accidental and not. School books in the early 50s told a story that a generation could live with. The chapters on 1933-1945 emphasized the rise and fall as if it were a storm. They described the suffering under bombs, the flight in winter, the hunger after. They condemned abuses and excesses. They spoke of a small clique responsible. They did not name the math teacher who had asked students to report their parents' jokes. They did not mention the policeman who had mocked a woman in a headscarf outside a DP camp in 1946. They were focused on the arithmetic of continued life, the new constitution, the new coins, the new lamps in the streets, that everyone agreed were better because they did not hiss and spit the way the old ones had. Public commemorations followed a similar script. Memorial days for the dead did not specify. Speeches said, "Victims of war and tyranny." Small plaques noted, "In memory of those who fell." They did not name who pushed or who pulled. In 1950, a parish erected a simple stone for the expelled. In 1952, a business association paid for a statue of a woman lifting a brick. She was called Trümmerfrau. The term had become a synonym for stalwart female virtue. The files show that while some women had done such work, many had not. The rebuilding had been also male, also institutional, also military. The statue created a memory that felt good to touch. People placed flowers at its base and felt absolution move through their fingers like the chill of stone. At home, Karl's children learned to draw flags in class. They colored black, red, gold. Their teacher told them that their country was new, that it would never be like the old one. The children learned English in school from men who had served in the occupation and married German women. They learned the word Marshall Plan and thought it was a person who visited their town in the night, leaving sacks of flour like a benevolent thief. Karl's wife cut coupons from newspapers. In 1953, they bought a radio. The voice of the new chancellor spoke of community and currency. That year, workers rose in the East and were crushed. The Cold War felt like a window that would not open. In 1955, the Bundeswehr was formed. The newspaper printed a photograph of young men in uniform swearing a new oath. For men like Karl, the picture was a knot in the stomach. The oath had changed. The uniforms had changed. The word "never again" was spoken in speeches. It was not always spoken at kitchen tables. The Wirtschaftswunder was less a miracle than a plan multiplied by luck. Korea created demand. Germans worked. Exports rose. The currency held. New housing estates grew at the edges of the city. 3 rooms for a small family. A balcony. A bathroom with hot water. The arithmetic of daily life turned positive for the first time in years. People counted savings rather than ration coupons. They counted on a future. They bought washing machines and curtains. They went to cinemas that played comedies, romances, Heimat film about villages that had never existed except in songs. The nostalgia was for a countryside of the mind where guilt could not cross the wooden bridge over a brook that had never held industrial poison. Within the files of the Office of Military Government lies a small, undated note. Population under stress responds well to routines. The sentence is both trivial and true. Routines are a kind of anesthesia. Karl's routines were precise. He woke at 6. He shaved with cold water until 1955, hot thereafter. He saved his receipts. He wrote in his notebook at night. He wrote down lines he could not say. He wrote, "We live by bargains, we do not name." In 1958, a group of prosecutors in Ulm tried former officers of the Einsatzgruppen. The verdicts were printed in the paper alongside advertisements for vacuum cleaners. The article included numbers of the murdered. The numbers sat heavily on a page that also contained a quiz about a new television program. In 1963, the Auschwitz trials began in Frankfurt. Witnesses spoke in voices that did not carry across the country, and yet they were heard. A man in Karl's office closed his door, then opened it, then closed it again. He had a cough that would not leave. The cough began when the witness said, "He always looked at his boots." Karl's son asked him in 1965, "What did you do?" It was a question and a test. Karl was careful. He said he had worked. He said he had wanted to protect his mother. He said he had not joined the party for love, but for bread. He did not say that he had drawn a plan for a barracks where men without papers slept. He did not say that he had filed a letter that had sent a neighbor to the labor office. He did not say that he had watched the film in 1945 and then said nothing for a year because he did not know how to carry the weight of it, and because silence was a habit, and because the walls in the new apartment block were thin. He wrote it down instead that night. He closed his notebook and put it in the drawer with the photographs. In 1968, students marched. They held signs that named judges and professors and editors who had been something else before. They shouted. They demanded. They called their fathers cowards, collaborators, sleepwalkers. The files show that the Ministry of the Interior collected reports on student slogans as if they were weather phenomena. Storm in Berlin, high pressure in Munich, scattered unrest. Karl watched them on television. He recognized the desire to be clean. He felt the desire sting. He wrote, "We did not wash off what could not be washed. We put on new shirts and went to work." The mathematics of life after war is not a ledger that can be balanced. It is a succession of partial payments, ignored debts, and small atonements. It is a hand raised for a woman at a tram stop when her package is full. It is a donation to a Jewish cultural center opening downtown in 1972. It is a vote for a party that promises a sober reckoning, followed by disappointment when reckoning is delayed because prosperity is dazzling and fear is easier to sell than shame. It is the hiring of an old colleague because he knows how to get permits approved. It is the decision to skip a memorial because the building is cold, the speech is longer than necessary, and the children's soccer match is that afternoon. Bundesarchiv records show that the denazification tribunals processed millions and categorized most as Mitläufer. The number is both a statistic and a mirror. When everyone is a follower, no one is responsible. When no one is responsible, nothing changes until an external shock arrives. The external shocks were many. In the 50s and 60s, they included the testimony of survivors, the books of journalists, the trials that printed guilt in column inches and photographs. They included neighbors who opened their mouths and said what had been said in kitchens to strangers on trains. The trains were no longer cattle cars, they were rolling lectures in how nations forget. Karl never went east again. The border cracked but did not open for him until he was too old to consider such a trip. He carried East Prussia in his head as a set of stories his father had told him in the 1920s. Snow, wolves, birch trees, a lake. He had carried Munich as a map of ruins and then as a map of floor plans. He kept working until 1973, when the city office thanked him for his service with a fountain pen and a handshake from a man who had been a Hitler youth leader, and then something else, and now something else again. He did not hate this man. He did not love him. He recognized him as a fellow element in a system that had needed to be something tomorrow. It had chosen to be an office. In his retirement, he volunteered to read to children at a local school. He experienced a small moment that he did not write down. A girl asked him why there were stones with names in front of certain buildings. They had been set there recently. Stolperstein, stumbling stones, brass glints in the sidewalk where shoes pass. He told her they were for people who had lived there before, who had been taken away. He said the words carefully. He made sure they were words a child could carry. He did not speak about the file he had once carried to an office with a clerk who later disappeared. He did not speak about the line he had written in 1945 that still felt hot. He saw his city move from scarcity to plenitude. He saw graffiti appear and vanish. He watched politicians raise their voices and then their glasses. He watched widows die and their apartments peeled open like boxes, contents removed, fresh paint applied, a new family installed. The arithmetic of space never stopped. The mathematics of guilt never settled. He read the newspapers. He saw debates about compensation for forced laborers stall and then move. He saw the government apologize and then argue about terms. He saw headlines about trials in small towns. He saw photographs of very old men with blankets over their knees, staring at the floor in courtrooms. He saw a young man describe a ditch and a count. He saw an elderly woman refuse to testify because she did not trust the story to hold her. Carl folded the paper softly, as if it were a fragile thing. Sometimes he walked to the statue of the Tremorfrau and stood at a distance. He watched a tourist photograph it and a pigeon fly from its head. He watched a youth on a skateboard slide past. He watched a man in a suit check his watch. He thought about the rubble women he had seen in 1945 and about the myth that had been built on their backs. He did not resent the myth. He saw it as a kind of plaster applied to a cracked wall, an attempt to hold a structure until deeper repairs could be made that would never be made because no one wants to take down a wall that keeps out the wind. His notebooks filled a drawer. The first pages were thick with fear and ash. The middle pages were about minutes from meetings and a dog he had acquired in 1949 and the way its ears reacted to music. The last pages grew thin. The handwriting steadied and then shook. He wrote about how a city learns to forget strategically. He wrote about how naming victims in stone is both generous and insufficient. He wrote about how children of men who had joined a party to keep a job demand answers that cannot satisfy because the questions themselves contain two historical meanings. He wrote about paper. He returned to paper again and again. The files outlasted him. The Spruchkammer boxes are catalogued and sit on shelves in a building with temperature control. The occupation reports are digitized. The Allied intelligence summaries can be downloaded on a winter afternoon and read with coffee. His name appears in a few. His agency appears in many. His decisions left traces, a family billeted here, a wall moved there, a permit granted, a refusal recorded and then reversed. He is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is the man in the proposed study of the 20th century who sits at a desk and scribbles a signature that carries the day forward. The day is many people's day. The thing he signs is very small, and also the point at which history gets made in ways no one can see until much later, perhaps not even then. In 1985, on a day that smelled of wet leaves, Carl wrote a last entry. Today, the city dedicated a plaque near the former Gestapo headquarters. The mayor spoke, a rabbi spoke, a woman from Silesia cried, and I did not know her. They used the word memories many times. Memory is work. Memory is also breath. We did not breathe for years. We held it. Now we let it out, and it hurts. He closed the notebook. He placed it next to the old photographs. He went to the kitchen and boiled water for tea. He watched steam rise and disappear. He returned to the desk and tore a page from the back of the notebook. He wrote the line again, the first line, as if the repetition might give it different weight, as if it could bear what he had carried and what he had let slide. He wrote, "We lost the war twice, once in the ruins, again in the silence." He added, for the first time, a sentence he had never dared to write. And I learned that the front line after 1945 ran through my memory and my paperwork, not across a battlefield.